Hi there, my name is Corey Dundon.
And I'm Michelle Maunder.
And you are listening to Spirited Conversations, engaging and elevating pediatric occupational therapists, a joint collaboration between SEED Pediatric Services and Developmental FX. Each week you'll hear from myself and Michelle as we nerd out with Tracy Stackhouse. Just a note before we start, Spirited Conversations is for informational purposes only. With that, let's jump in to today's episode. Hello, wonderful women. I weirdly was re-listening to our second episode on posture, and it's such a strange experience re-listening to our episodes. It feels like I'm listening as if I am not part of it and I'm learning. And as I do, I had questions about what we were talking about. So for those people that didn't listen to that episode, we talked about a 12-year-old boy who had come into the clinic to see me for an assessment, and I think he was just needing a handwriting assessment. I didn't do any further treatment with that kiddo. I just collected some information and provided some recommendations. And so in that discussion, I had done a bunch of clinical observations and some standardized testing and had some data to sort of talk about in relation to the postural system. And obviously there's lots of other stuff going on around that, but I had some thoughts about some of the things that we had discussed. And then also some listeners had some questions in relation to some of the treatment strategies that we talked about at the end of that episode, particularly related to extension and upright posture and how to maintain that through treatment. And then I've also had some discussions recently with some OT friends who were wondering about the reflex part of this as well, because in our clin obs, we often test for ATNR. I did a tonic labyrinthine test, and they're reflex-based tests. And so there's a lot of wondering around why we do those tests, how they relate to treatment, what does that mean? And then, some people talk about reflex integration. I don't really know anything about that. I haven't done any training on that, but that's a question that often comes up. But we should flesh that out today. Are you guys happy to chat about that today? Do you have thoughts about it?
I love it. I'd love to talk about that. It's often one of the places people tend to start, and certainly when you have new therapists working in peds, it seems like they can get a handle on posture and perhaps moving into planning a little easier than some of the other concepts. So I think it's a topic that lots of ped OTs talk about. So yeah, we should know this stuff really well, particularly how we might look at it different to a physio and perhaps a chiropractor or someone who comes with a really reflex retraining or integration approach rather than our more, I guess, functional. I come at it at a much more functional, and what does posture offer, and what's lack of posture impacting on, rather than a pure I want you to be upright kind of just because that's good posture and it's good musculoskeletally and it'll avoid scoliosis or, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, how it allows function.
It's about function.
Yeah, so many layers. So maybe we should just start with a basic clinical reasoning flow, which would be if we use the wisdom of Dr. Ayers and think about the classic Ayers flow chart. How that's organized is really kind of from a left to right flow, where on the right-hand side you have those occupational outcomes. What is it that your upright, engaged life moving about the world needs from your body in terms of how your postural ocular system serves you as an agent of interaction in the world. So that would be on the right-hand side. And then how we track that back in the wisdom of that framework is we look at the elements that give rise to anti-gravity control and bilateral control and movement capacity. And those are going to be grounded back in sensory and motor systems, and then you can break that down in a really particular way. So that flow, hopefully just kind of painting that picture, and whatever anybody's orientation is could fit into some kind of flow like that. Does something like that work for you both in terms of just basic organizing?
I'm picturing the table in the SI Theory and Practice, 3rd edition. I think it's in every edition, but the table that they've put together, one side's sort of modulation-based and one side's discrimination-based, which is the postural side. And they start with nervous system and then they move out into more functional pieces that relate to the very end point, which is upright control of gravity with ease and fluidity, I'm guessing. Yeah, so is that what you're sort of picturing in your brain, or you're picturing something different?
Yeah, so that is one way of thinking about it, and I do think we should talk a little bit about that, because for me it actually brings up something that we need to integrate into our thinking. So let me get really specific here. Are we ready to kind of get juicy with something?
Yes.
So
we are.
In the kind of traditional way of thinking about this from an heirs perspective, and what you're referencing is the current chart that Shelley Lane and Anita Bundy are using, where you start with the nervous system in the middle, and to the right-hand side of that particular chart, you're looking at sensory discrimination and perceptual functions. And so much of Dr. Ayers' work early on talked about how the somatosensory processing, in particular vestibular processing, and the body-based proprioceptors are going to give rise to our sensory motor control. And so postural systems derive from sensory motor systems, and they're based in vestibular functions. And so in the Ayers tradition, what you're looking at is really a sensory discrimination base to this ability to start to have postural control, bilateral control, balance, and a number of different functions. And we can go into this in more detail, but the thing that I want to pause and say is that we know also that our postural system is actually a reflection of our modulation and our state. It's state dependent. So if you are a person who tends to hang out in arousal states that are not really typical levels of activation, you're going to see it in the postural system. If you have children who are in more activation because they have to be more protective of themselves, you will see protective postures, and you will see activation of the postural system in that direction. Or any other scenario there, right, around changes in arousability. So really, whenever we see differences in postural systems, we can't just think about it through that sensory discrimination lens or the right-hand side of that chart. We really have to think more broadly and wonder about, where is this coming from? Because how we treat it ends up entirely dependent on that question. And because that's not always evident, sometimes people start to treat the thing that is the most evident. So let's say that we have a child who has a presentation where their basic reflexes are still showing up in typical movement patterns. Then what happens is that for certain treatment approaches, that becomes like this really shiny thing, like, oh my goodness, we need to work on integrating that reflex. But if you back up and think about it, if you are in protective defense, you will have activation, potentiation of reflexes to help you be stronger, to help you fend off whatever the threat is that might be perceived out there. So for modulation reasons, we're going to see reflex potentiation, and the treatment isn't to integrate the reflex. The treatment is to get the person into a state of safety. In the same logic, if you see the reflex present and you are wondering, is that reflex there to give them more gravity, anti-gravity assistance because they have a weakness or a reduction of muscle tone or something like that, or they haven't sufficiently activated neck righting and equilibrium responses. So you're going to see the reflex, but the treatment isn't reflex integration. The treatment is to work on the postural function itself, maybe activating, or maybe it's the vestibular function that underlies that. So yeah, it's always important to not go for that shiny thing that seems easy to name, but pause and say, why is this here? So yeah, that's a lot. I just said a lot. So I'm going to pause and catch your responses.
I love that you started with the person. I think your opening paragraphs is really around the person and what does their body need to do for them. And I think for me, that's the root of this, that we're going back to the macro, really, of what is this person and the system and that they're presenting to us or working from, and how does that impact on their posture. And that it's a system, really, rather than their discrete postural capacities or their discrete reflex capacities look like this. Because if we miss, oh my goodness, they're really over responding to auditory, tactile, not processing vestibular well. That impacts their posture. And if we get stuck on that, we're never going to get anywhere because it's not the root issue. The root issue is the modulation piece. But starting bigger will help you see the wood for the trees, I think, and not... and see the reflexes as an outcome rather than perhaps the root.
Yeah. I had thoughts to clarify around to see if I was understanding correctly, which was, say you have a thing that you notice, which is maybe it's a reflex, and let's give something concrete. So in my example in episode 2, I did a tonic labyrinthine test and I had a clear outcome that said that wasn't integrated. So he tipped his head backwards and he had autonomic responses, eye fluttering, was trying to recruit visual system, proprioceptive system by collapsing and deflection to help support himself in that specific situation. So in that, I could go multiple directions in terms of treatment. So I could be like, oh, that reflex isn't integrated. I could just work purely on integrating that specific thing. That's what you mean by grabbing the shiny thing, right? So I could be like, okay, there's the shiny thing. That's what he's struggling with. That's what I'm going to work on. Then what you were trying to say, Tracy, was that if I step back and have a look at him holistically, then I can try to think about multiple things, which is how are the sensations integrating and organizing his body to allow him to manage that situation. My head tips backwards. How do I respond to that? And then how does that impact on his function day to day? So that's one piece I could think about. But then the third piece was the modulation element of that, which is when that happens to him, when his head tips backwards, he became clearly distressed, which is not just a discrimination function, it's a state and arousal issue. So because you were saying that you can look at the postural system and it relates directly to state. My state impacts my posture impacts my state bidirectionally. Yes. So they have this relationship where they influence each other. So for him, I can think about the underlying sensory integrative component of his postural system and how that helps him day to day. But then I can also think about the fact that that was really anxiety provoking for him and how that impacts his function as well. And I probably need to be thinking about all those things in the treatment session and then also working on it in a way that's not just specifically targeting the reflex. Now, have I summed that correctly?
Absolutely. And the other beautiful thing about occupational therapy as a discipline is that while you're addressing and understanding that you're approaching it from that deeper level of understanding about the processing of discrimination and modulation function, but you're doing it in a way that's related to what is it that he wants to do with his body in the world, and how is he going to find that motivation and engagement to make use of the sensation. You know, every time that we think about sensory integrative function and we come back to the core definition from Dr. Ayers around the organization of sensation for use, that thread that goes from, if I tip my head back, my vestibular activation related to how my postural system is working, is not giving me what I need to make use of the world. And so now I'm getting overwhelmed and a little scared. And then I have to pull into a more primitive pattern to start to even try to make sense of that, which further restricts me from being able to have the freedom to do the things that I want to do. And so all the time we're seeing the full dynamic system of this process in action. And if we get too stuck in treating any one part of it, we're going to kind of miss it. But also, if we don't treat the whole of it, we're going to miss it. So that's why this process is so complex and so rich and so real and true and authentic, because it is exactly a reflection of what happens in neurodevelopment.
Oh, wow. That's so helpful, Tracy. So why then, because we always reference Dr. Ayres and we love Dr. Ayres, and so why then did she have, in her clinical observations, she obviously saw the reflexes as important, and they allow us to gain some insight into what's going on for the child. So, but I wonder why, can we unpack that a little bit more? Like, why do you think that she had that in there, and what do you think she had that there to allow us to sort of gather and glean from that?
So most versions of the Ayres clinical observations have some degree of reflex testing. What's also, I want to mention though, before I answer the question or try to kind of discuss the answer with you guys, if you go to a neurologist, they do an assessment because you have a complaint about whatever, lots of things. One of the things that's true in a standard neurological assessment is that they look at reflex integration, because the way that your body moves in these prototypical patterns is a reflection of the integrity of processing in the system. So the integrity of processing is kind of a little bit of a spin on integration, right? And Dr. Ayres, she talked about poorly integrated postural and ocular mechanisms are an important window into understanding what's happening in the processing in general. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So Dr. Ayres was interested not so much in the product of, is there the presentation of a reflex when you provoke it? Because most of the tests provoke the reflex. They're there on purpose to kind of elicit the reflex. So if you see the reflex in a very strong pattern, that's the product. You're eliciting a product. But what she was really wanting us to look at was the pattern. What's happening to bring about that adaptive function? Because in that way, a postural reflex is just an adaptation. It's a response to a stimulus. And so if I tip my head in a certain way, if I load my weight onto my arms or my postural system in a certain way, and then I move my body, I might evince that adaptation. So how is it supporting me? How is it bringing about a level of support to allow me to maintain anti-gravity control or to maintain my body alignment? Or do I not have the activation of my system that allows me to just easily handle that stressor? And so now I see the reflex as a partner in the dynamic system that allows me to maintain my anti-gravity control. Because lots of times if you are in an anti-gravity position that then you stress, what happens is you collapse, or you see this intensity of response that misaligns the whole system, and it moves you out of being able to stay in adaptation, in a functional pattern that would allow you to just continue to reach or continue to look or continue to stand or continue to crawl or whatever. So the pattern itself is what you're looking at. You're looking at the big picture. And what you're wondering about is, why is the body the postural system not sufficiently able to respond to that? Is it because when I move in a rotational pattern, my mix of stability holding patterns and mobility movement patterns is getting out of synchrony? And where does synchrony come from? Where does the relationship of my midline to my movement patterns come from? Turns out it comes from the vestibular proprioceptive apparatus. So it's often just a reflection of this underlying processing issue. But it also could be not just the discriminative processing, but the modulation processing. So yeah, it always opens that question. Is it discrimination or modulation? Every time it's going to open that question, and we have to dive into it. So yeah, Michelle?
I kind of see it as, like, often we've already seen through the way they walk in or sit down and, participate even before we perhaps start clin-orbs. I've already got an assessment, it's your postural system and in the functions that underlie that, sensory probe tactile. And I see the bits that fall out of it, so including their reflexes, is their unique way that they're managing or trying to be adaptive when they don't have those functions working well. So sometimes it can look like they've got lots, you see the reflexes really strongly, or other times their adaptive way to manage the lack of posture and stability and staying regulated is a refusal. They just say, I'm not going to do it. So that you just actually don't get to see the reflexes because they won't do it. But for me, it's their best shot at being adaptive. And sometimes when they do it, when they agree to do the things you're asking to do it, you do see the reflex happen, but that's how their body's trying to compensate for a lack of something else. Am I putting that together okay?
No, I think you absolutely are putting it together. And it's just, I think that the wonder in your voice and the lack of certainty is really because we're talking in generalities right now. So when you land it, when you're with a child and you're feeling that experience of being with them, you're going to tune in to their lack of awareness of their body and space. And so when you put them on a movable surface and they start to be uncertain about, oh my goodness, how do I maintain my balance and stability when this thing is moving me? And you can really get a clearer tacit sense of how clearly that is because they lose their sense of body schema and awareness, and it doesn't stay with them as that projected action sequence of movement underneath them starts to move. And you would know that, you would feel it, you would name that, you would identify it because it becomes quite concrete in the moment versus the child who is so terrified of anything that's unpredictable. And you would know that experience for that child was more based on their fear of unpredictability. And that could also come from their body, but it could come from the world, right? So you would start to be able to identify that based on who is this child and what's the experience they're having and how do I understand them. Yes. So you've totally got it, Michelle, but I think it's because when we talk about kids and cases, it's easier to land this than it is when we're talking in a more kind of conceptual way. Yeah.
General way.
My thoughts were, because when you started the conversation, Tracy, you talked about Dr. Ayres and her looking at those tests, so the reflexes, to glean something from the integration piece. And I thought it was really interesting that neurologists do this too. So it's not like we are doing this woo-woo thing. We're actually just trying to get an understanding of the nervous system so that we can piece that to function. Because that's what we do as pediatric OTs more specifically. Try to glean something from the nervous system so I can understand how that's impacting occupational performance. And so we do an AT&R test often, right? So get a kid on all fours and you make sure that they don't lock their elbows out and you gently turn their head to one side, and you see whether the postural system can sustain alignment or whether it doesn't. And so that's a stress on the system and whether it can integrate around that specific task. And so if I did that test and I stressed the system and I saw the reflex, then are you saying that that's helpful in that moment because they can't integrate that stress? And so the body does the function that helps it the most, which is to collapse and pull in. That's that pattern.
Yeah, or it could be that when you move the head out of midline alignment, you get a differential firing pattern in the neck musculature that then fuels what's going to happen below that. So that's partly a vestibular signal. It's also a matching of the neck proprioceptors. And when you get this mis-signaling between the neck proprioceptors and what the body is trying to do and the vestibular system, moving into more of a collapse is going to be protective because it's sort of like, what's happening? I don't know how to maintain myself here. I don't know what is going on. So, and as that differential firing pattern happens, trying to come back to, well, where am I? Where's my base of stability? A collapse is kind of the closest thing to that. And so there is a little bit of a collapse that is most likely going to happen. But it's partly because the adaptation is, let me come back to my most primitive pattern and resort what's going on. Where should I find strength? Where should I be pushing into? What position do you want me to be in? It's also interesting because being in 4-point and then turning your head to the side, once we're out of baby crawling life, right? We aren't in that position very often, and it isn't a super adaptive position. So especially when you get really asymmetrical in your firing pattern. So it's kind of interesting in lots of ways to think about it. But yeah, so your logic is right in terms of thinking about the adaptation. But then also what happens is that if you have a higher level of ability to recruit assistance against gravity, what should happen is a weight shift to the opposite side that holds the integrity, right? Because that's where crawling comes from. So I start to collapse. What I should do is find my strength instead of go into collapse. And so what we're looking at is not just does the collapse happen, but what is the adaptive response to the collapse? Are they working actively against it? Or do they allow the collapse to happen? And isn't that interesting to think about? What should it be pulling for? What should it be producing that's a little higher level? What you will see in a person who doesn't evince the big reflex is you'll start to see a little bit of collapse, but then you see a postural adjustment that corrects the course. So when you don't see postural adjustment, that's when Dr. Ayers suggests that you're not seeing a sufficient activation of the system itself. And so again, the problem isn't the reflex, the problem is the lack of sufficient response.
Yes. So let me just clarify the neurological piece of the reflex, and then Michelle, you can go for it. So that child who has the big reflex, if I turn their head, you're saying that it's related to the vestibular organs on each side of the head firing into the postural system. And because when I turn the head, each organ gets different stimulus, then I'm going to activate down the postural system asymmetrically. So one side's going to get a different activation to the other to maintain my position. But if I haven't organized and integrated that with the proprioceptors of the neck and the body, then sometimes to manage that, then I have to pull in the reflex. Whereas if I can integrate that difference, moving my head, asymmetrical firing of the vestibular system with the proprioceptors of the neck of the body, then I can make the adjustment to manage that stress or input.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It also, at a higher level, tells you that the treatment approach that Dr. Ayers suggested here is pretty accurate still, because what she talked about is when you see this difficulty, what you want to do is create a vestibular proprioceptive opportunity to work on pulling for righting reactions and equilibrium responses that are the higher level integration above the reflex, right? But what you want to do is really work on the righting response and the equilibrium that allows for that reflex to be made use of appropriately, and so that it doesn't have to garner all the attention. It's like the righting responses and the equilibrium responses are really what postural adaptation is all about. And so what you want to see is the balance of relationship of stability mobility within the context of righting and equilibrium. And what happens in the righting and equilibrium responses is that you get this beautiful weight shifting. You start to pull in alignment. You start to get gradations of rotational responses around that midline where you're balancing and maintaining alignment so that your body can keep doing what it wants to do. So your body can keep moving or holding on or reaching. And that body action could be happening anywhere, from the eyes to the head to the trunk itself to the extremities, or even to the distal parts of our extremities. You're going to see the exact same beautiful orchestration of stability, mobility, reaching for the eyes or trying to pick up a little piece of lint on the floor as you're reaching forward without falling over. And the reason this is also critically important to life function, I'm thinking about a couple of individuals who I've worked with over the years. One was a woman who was about 18 years old when she was referred to me. She's a woman who has a diagnosis of autism. She also had a lot of restrictions in her cognitive and language skills, and her profile was pretty complicated. But the reason she was referred to me was that she had been moved into this high school program, and the high school program had this goal for her to be able to do a more independence in her daily living skills. In particular, things like picking up her shoes and putting them on. And she couldn't lean over. And it turned out, when I met with her mom, that since she was about 7 or 8 years of age, she had stopped ever leaning over. She wouldn't ever lean over and pick anything up off the floor. And so this has been for more than a decade, that leaning over to get out of bed, to get into the bathtub, to do even toileting, all of these things, she was so restricted, she wouldn't do any of them. She was so rigid in her posture. She was so fixed and held. And so, you know, people had been doing all of these sort of behavioral interventions with her to try to get her to lean over and pick up her shoes and get a reward of some Skittles or something like that to pick up her shoes or whatever. But everyone was missing that this was all based back in her vestibular system and in the integrity of her ability to make use of her postural system. And so this kind of relates to a question that we also had from a listener about how long do I have to treat these sensory-based issues to support posture. And so in this case, I did a really intensive, vestibularly focused intervention with her, where she would come in several times a week. I was really working with her quite intensively, and then gave her parents a home program. And, you know, within about 4 months, she suddenly started to find delight with moving her head through space. And a few months later, she started to just automatically understand the space above her in standing, the space down by her feet were all available to her. And that discovery came from the integrity of the vestibular system supporting her posture. It didn't come from training her to bend over and pick up her shoes, but it allowed her the freedom to do that. And this is a person who was pretty restricted in lots of her different skill sets, but she found so much joy. And now her most favorite thing in the whole world is to go on a cruise. And she before couldn't do it because she also couldn't enjoy that kind of movement. And so it sort of changed everything for their whole family, because they go on Disney cruises now, and funny things like that, that just opened the world to her. And the vestibular system really does that to you. It can restrict you so much that you really can't move, and you really can't find the freedom to bend over nor get on a boat. So yeah, pretty powerful.
Trace, that's so
Amazing.
wonderful that they met with you and that you've changed their trajectory, really. Or so beautiful case to illustrate getting the intervention right, I guess, and understanding the lack of integration that was at the root of that, rather than the other approaches that weren't landing for her. I'm fascinated that you mentioned she had lower cognitive capacities, if I heard that right. But there was a knowing that this is not working for me and I'm going to avoid this. And it didn't matter the lure. I'm sure whatever was her currency, her special interests, they were, painting them big and bright and making them super attractive to her. But she just was still had a knowing, when my head does this, I don't feel safe, and I'm not going to do that for the bright and shiny things that you're offering me for decades. So that's of interest to me, and I guess that was my question earlier, that this is all pretty automatic, and we're not necessarily thinking about it. I guess the opposite is that where we see kids with perhaps more cognitive function, where they go around it, they anticipate, and maybe this is really subconscious as well, like it was perhaps for this beautiful lady you mentioned, that when Michelle's going to tilt my head again in the ATNR example, there's a locking that, that they're like, whoa, at some point their body's like, wow, this doesn't work out well for me. I'm not going to collapse. I'll lock out instead. Whatever it is, but there's a, whoa, I know what's happening here, and they get really adaptive. And sometimes, look, with a really good eye, we can still spot that, but it can get harder when they've got high cognitive capacity and they've worked out ways to get around it, because they don't fully collapse and you don't see the full, whole complete reflex. You see it start to happen, and then they do, move out of it or laterally shift and lock elbows so that they don't collapse. But yeah, interesting Trace. I wonder, can you talk about that automation, that this is really a reflex is just that arc, that there's not necessarily conscious control of this, particularly for that your beautiful lady.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is this low-level pattern that is just a pure reflex. I mean, it really does have that quality to it. But because it's not happening in the peripheral nervous system, where we think of other reflexes, like if you think about
the pain one?
Say again?
Like the pain where you step on a tack and it goes to the spinal
Yes.
cord and it comes straight back and you pull your foot away.
That's exactly right. Or, if you're doing like a patellar kind of stimulus to kind of evince this little reflex arc in the leg, where you just see the activation pattern. Because these deeper reflexes, these postural reflexes, are integrated through the sensory motor circuitry, there's lots of other influences to them. And so just like you were saying, Michelle, if somebody is like, every time, if I am in this position and I turn my head, this thing is going to happen to me. So I'm going to really super avoid that. And what you'll hear, it's interesting. I have a friend who is an OT, but for a really long time, she's worked as a driving coach for people that have all different kinds of issues, whether they've had head injuries in their life, or maybe they're living with some level of neurodiversity, and so they are wanting to learn how to drive a car. But she hears this story all the time about individuals who are like, okay, the hardest part is when I'm holding onto the steering wheel and I have to look all the way behind me to my left or my right, and I pull on the steering wheel. And it's a reflex, right? So that's the ATNR kicking in. And as soon as I turn my head, I know I'm gonna turn the steering wheel. And so there's all these strategies that they have to do what you just described, Michelle, about this little guy who might just get really stiff and say, I'm not gonna let that happen. I'm not gonna collapse. And so we can kind of override it through the activation patterns that we can pull into our new plan, but then we become really inefficient. You both are super active and do lots of finesse things with your bodies. I try, but I'm less competent in some ways. So I had this experience in the last year where I've been trying to do some stand-up paddleboarding, which is a riot and really hard because the surface is really unstable. And
Tracy, could you send me some video, please? That will be my bright, shiny thing. Whatever, I will do whatever you want as long as you trade me some video of you on paddleboard.
yes, it's comical. It's beyond comical, but partly because...
Oh, Tracy, go Tracy.
But you can, I have really low muscle tone. I have a large frame, and I find myself having to breathe through, relax, don't hold, don't fix there, allow for the rotation, feel your body in space. And I know how the whole system works, so I can kind of coach myself in my head.
Totally. And for context, Tracy is tall. So getting on a paddleboard, your center of gravity over your base of support is very high. So it's a challenge. It's even more of a challenge for you, Trace. So I can appreciate that. But it's so true. You see these patterns. And I guess, Tracy, if you weren't more integrated, so you should prop yourself up a little bit there, you would just spend the whole time falling off, or you'd be too worried to even get on the board, right?
You could do that too. Just for me, Trace, one day. Just relax. Don't think any thoughts. We could make big money on that, Tracy's paddleboarding YouTube channel. I'm picking on you.
I love it.
But you're so playful, and that's tricky, and you can think through, you've got capacity to do it, you're brave, and hopefully you're doing it with some friends who are, giggling and laughing and co-regulating you together, but you're having a go. But you've got a lot of resources and it's still taxing on you. So if you found some rapids or you ran into reeds or there was piranhas in the thing, all of that would drop off a bit. And then some of our kids do not have those resources to pull on, to giggle through it and entertain Michelle and Corey.
So I'm wondering, you were sort of saying there, Tracy, if it's because Michelle talked about the kid that can cognitively sort of override it, but then because that system should be so automatic, as soon as you have to pull in the cognitive piece, it becomes a much more taxing task. And that just made me think about many of the kiddos that we see who are doing pretty well, but they're so fatigued by the end of the day and then they fall apart. And we don't know exactly why, but sometimes when you gather more information, having to think through almost everything that should often just be this automatic piece that supports them to do the day-to-day things. And that was pretty relevant for the kiddo in episode 2 as well. I remember even the fact that he was asking about having to hold the paper, which is an automatic function. When you write, you don't think about holding the paper. You just hold it because it's efficient. It works better to do it that way. But if I'm holding my postural system up with my arm, because I don't have ease and uprightness due to the integrity of the vestibular proprioceptive somatosensory system, then I have to think about all of those pieces, which makes me tired. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of where we were getting at in a very fun way.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yeah, so it's like, Is it vestibularly based? Is it in the motor patterns? Is it in their muscle tone? Is it in their strength and endurance? Is it the impact of the vestibular on their strength? Like, all of those are live questions when we are trying to figure out how to help this person engage and perform and be fully available to do their handwriting in class, or to do the stand-up paddleboarding, or to get on and off the swing in the clinic, or to climb over us as we're playing rough and tumble on the floor, whatever it is that's happening, right? So it's all of those things. And yeah, the postural system should become pretty automatic. I think even in little babies, once they get it, and they move to the next stage, right? They get integrity in their prone prop and their shoulder girdle, and now they can move around in pivot prone, and it's just there and it's available, and it doesn't matter that their head is moving. You can pull the reflex in a 5-month-old, but it doesn't influence them too much because they have all this ability to move around. So when we see it in an 8-year-old or in an 18-year-old, you have to ask a lot of questions, and you're asking those questions from the far left of the grid to the far right of the grid and all the way across. It's really about sorting it from each level of processing to the occupational outcome, back and forth, over and over again.
Wow, what a wonderful discussion. I have lots to think about. I had thoughts even just in terms of the wonderful young woman that you were working with, Tracy, the treatment process for her, because I have a wondering about what that looked like. I'm sure it was very refined. So I would love to talk about that next episode, and we can talk about exactly how you came to that end point where she was able to find herself in space, use the space above her, use the space below her, enjoy cruises, all of these things, how these were able to come about through this process over 4 months. I think that would be super valuable. I know I would love that discussion. So I would think we should chat about that next time. What do you guys think?
Love it.
I think
love
it's
it.
a great idea.
Yeah.
Vestibular treatment can feel mysterious, and it's also quite full of principles, and then also the nuance of just beautiful, engaged relational treatment. So I think it'll be really fun to talk through that and learn a little bit more together. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we'll see everybody next time. Thank you, wonderful women.
Thank you. Don't forget to send those videos on, please, Trace. See you, everyone.
This podcast is brought to you by SEED, Pediatric Services and Developmental FX. For more information, please go to our show notes on our website, spiritedconversationspodcast.com, or catch us on our SEED and Developmental FX Facebook or Insta pages. So grateful to have you with us for this episode. Take care, and we'll see you next time.